Bonjour.
Good afternoon.
Ladies and gentlemen, Madame and Monsieur. We are about to start the second sessions of the afternoon. My name is Guillermo de los Reyes. Je m'appelle Guillermo de los Reyes. Je suis professeur at
And I am a professor at the University of Houston.
English, but thank you for being here. It is my great honor to be the chair of this amazing panel with three scholars who will talk today about the before the tricentenary of the Anderson's Constitution, as you know, a very important aspect on the history of Freemasonry. First, we will have the presentations first, and at the end, we will have some questions. First, we have Professor Andrew Prescott, who is a professor of digital humanities at the University of Glasgow, and as I'm very sure that you all know, is a great scholar of the history of Freemasonry. And recently, along with another member of this panel, Professor Susan Sommers, they published a very interesting text on the origins of Freemasonry that they actually presented at last conference here in Paris. But today, Dr. Prescott will talk about the genesis of the 1723 Book of Constitutions. Please join me to welcome Professor Prescott.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Daniel, and thank you very much to Paul, Daniel, Pierre Mollier, and the other organisers of this conference for this opportunity to kick off early the celebrations of the 300th anniversary of the publication of the Book of Constitutions. And as well as offering thanks, I should also offer an apology at the beginning because of the very curious way that Mac PowerPoints transfer to PCs. Instead of some of the wonderful adverts I was going to show you, there'll not be adverts for the Book of Constitutions as I hoped, but adverts for cures for dropsy and things like that. So we'll try and cover that up as best we can as we go along, but apologies for that slight technical mismatch. Next year, 2023, marks the 300th anniversary of the publication of the first printed Book of Constitutions of the Grand Lodge, formerly established in London 2 years previously. This is an anniversary whose significance extends beyond Freemasonry. The distinguished historian of 18th century Britain, Dame Linda Colley, has recently suggested that the publication of constitutions by Freemasons contributed to the political enthusiasm for written constitutions, not only in the United States and France, but also in smaller countries such as Corsica and the Pitcairn Islands in the late 18th and early 19th centuries. While the 1723 constitutions are among the most celebrated Masonic publications, and the name of its author, James Anderson, is well known, there has been little discussion of the circumstances of the compilation and publication of the 1723 constitutions. The process of compiling and publishing the Book of Constitutions was highly contentious and led to one of the first public controversies involving the new Grand Lodge. Much of the impetus behind the production of the Book of Constitutions came not from the Grand Lodge or its officers, but rather from the booksellers and publishers who saw the Book of Constitutions as their property. The story of the production of the Book of Constitutions shows that the creation of the new Grand Lodge was by no means uncontroversial, and there were key figures who objected to the political and social baggage of the new Grand Lodge. The Book of Constitutions was produced at the Grand Lodge on the 17th of January 1723, and its publication was approved and the book recommended for the use of lodges. 1 week later, an incendiary advertisement headed "For the benefit of the ancient society of Freemasons," appeared on the front page of the newspaper, the Daily Journal. The advertisement began by noting that there is now ready for publication a new set of constitutions and orders very different from the ancient, by which the said society has been happily and quietly regulated for many ages past. The advertisement then launched a ferocious attack on the new constitutions and their author. It continued, "The extravagant length of the said new constitutions and orders, exceeding that of 4 ordinary sermons, makes it most evident that they are calculated at the expense and damage of the society merely to serve the interest of one single member, the author, whose assurance was such that he got them printed off before he offers them to the general censure of the fraternity. For which reasons, we hope, the Brotherhood will not now be over hasty to encourage the said innovator." The new constitutions were, the advertisement claimed, a scam and an imposition on the brethren. The existing constitutions were perfectly satisfactory and could be printed for a fraction of the price of 2 shillings and 6pence, which was being charged for the new constitutions. The advertisement promised all lovers of pure masonry, abstracted from innovations and self-interest, that they will speedily be prepared and delivered to them without cost, the ancient constitutions and orders taken from the best copies, wherein such errors in history and chronology, which by the carelessness of the several transcribers have crept into them, will be fully rectified. This version of the constitutions would shortly be printed for the cost of 6pence instead of 2 shillings and 6pence, and on as good a paper as the new constitutions. The man responsible for attacking Anderson's Book of Constitutions before it even appeared was James Roberts, one of the most prolific trade publishers in London. Roberts published a very wide range of books and pamphlets, ranging from works by Henry Fielding to more scurrilous anti-Catholic publications. Roberts was rumoured to have been closely connected with Edmund Curll, the notorious publisher of pornographic books and the butt of Alexander Pope's jokes. Roberts's attack on the 1723 constitutions was doubtless partly motivated by pique that he had missed out on a major commercial publishing opportunity. But Roberts's ire also reflects issues which go back to the origins of the compilation of the new constitutions. The Masonic Lodge associated with St. Paul's, which is supposed to have met at the Goose and Gridiron, saw itself as the guardian of the traditions of the craft. This is partly because it possessed some of the oldest and most elaborate copies of the old charges. At the dinner in June 1721, at which the existing Masonic lodges in London and Westminster agreed to place their authority in trust to a new Grand Lodge, and the Duke of Montague was elected Grand Master, George Payne of the Horn Lodge in Westminster sensationally produced the Cook manuscript of the old charges, which was demonstrably much, much older than any of the manuscripts held by the St. Paul's Lodge. As the possessor of a much older manuscript of the old charges, Payne and the Horn Lodge were able to challenge the claim of the St. Paul's Lodge to be the guardian of the ancient lights of Masonry. Moreover, the Cook manuscript differed in substantial points from the other manuscripts of the old charges known to the London lodges. The most urgent requirement posed by the discovery of the Cook manuscript was to work out how far errors had entered into the history and chronology of the old charges. The manuscripts needed to be reconciled and monkish error removed. This was the job that James Anderson, who was already working for the publishers of the new constitutions, was commissioned to do. But the idea of jettisoning the old charges and replacing them with a revised and up-to-date text was contentious from the start and seems to have been a major focus of resistance to the new Grand Lodge. James Roberts was took the most prominent role in resisting the compilation of the new Book of Constitutions. Determined to demonstrate that the old charges could be retained, he reprinted the old charges in one of his journals, The Postman, in July and August 1722. The reprinting of the old charges was evidently intended to undermine the project to impose the new constitutions. In September 1722, Roberts took matters a stage further by publishing separately a version of the old charges which he claimed had been taken from a manuscript over 500 years old, suggesting that the text was of comparable authority to the Cook manuscript. Roberts's publication also contained some, quote, new articles said to have been promulgated in December 1663, which was also intended to undermine the argument that the constitutions needed bringing up to date. Now here you've got a completely irrelevant advert, so don't worry. It should have been an advert that Grand Lodge took out in response to Roberts's publication of the old charges, and this advert was, quote, to advise the public that the same is false and spurious, nor does the said Book of Constitutions contain anything like the true constitutions of the society, but is calculated to deceive the public, whereof we desire the brotherhood to take notice. The timing of the various approbations included in the 1723 Book of Constitutions show that the text took a long time to compile. This was apparently not only due to Anderson not working as speedily as he might, but also possibly the result of debates within Grand Lodge. The grandiloquent language of the first approbation in the 1723 Constitutions is evidently the work of Anderson himself. It states that the Duke of Montagu, having had the manuscript read and corrected by several brethren, ordered it to be printed, but that it was not ready for the press when Montagu stepped down as Grand Master. It seems possible that sections were possibly printed in the summer of 1722, which may account for Roberts's claim that the book had been printed without the permission of Grand Lodge. There was continued revision and additions to the book, including the addition of the songs and other supplementary material until January 1723. The delays proved sufficiently long that it was thought desirable to insert a second approbation in the names of Grand Master Walton and his deputy Desaguliers. On the 11th of February 1723, and this is just the bottom of the advert, James Roberts launched a preemptive strike against the publication of the new constitutions by advertising his edition of the old charges at this promised price of sixpence. So get your constitutions early from James Roberts. And then the following week, there we go, if we can get that. And now John's, oh, there we go. The following week, there was another really hefty attack. Sorry, that's gone too far. Let's go back. Sorry, pardon me. Got into trouble here. Let's see what we can do. Oh, that's no good. Because you'd like to see this one, I'm sure. There we are. That's where we should be. So this appears the week after Roberts is advertising. Hello, it's got a mind of its own here. This book, which will appear in a second, 2, 3, appears the week after Roberts has advertised his edition of the Constitutions, and it's a really hefty attack on Grand Lodge, and it's the bawdy Hudibrastic poem, The Freemasons, which parodied the Masons' traditional history and accused lodges of indulging in such practices as sodomy and masturbation. This lively piece of 18th century erotica ran through 3 editions in a week. It was published under a false imprint, but there can be little doubt that James Roberts, who was active in the publication of erotica and well versed in the use of false imprints, was responsible for the Hudibristic poem. Its appearance must have been particularly upsetting to Anderson because he'd been the target of 2 other obscene publications in 1720. Although Anderson's not directly referred to in the Hudibrastic poem, the dedication is addressed to, quote, one of the wardens of the Society of Freemasons. Anderson claimed to be a warden, although there's doubts about that, who was said to have been, quote, a mercenary scribbler. It was under these circumstances that the London booksellers John Senex and John Hook advertised the publication of the Book of Constitutions on the 23rd of February 1723. But the appearance of the Book of Constitutions seems to have just added to the controversy rather than settling it. On the 6th of April 1723, the London Journal reported that the Society of Freemasons had given orders to prosecute with the utmost severity a gentleman who had criticised the management of Grand Lodge in one of their meetings. And the following month, Henry Pritchard was tried for assault after breaking the head of one Adam Barrett for, quote, abusing the ancient Society of Freemasons in a very scandalous manner and with very indecent expressions, particularly relating to some noble persons of that fraternity mentioned by name. The jury found against Pritchard, but because of the very great provocation, only awarded 20 shillings damages, and Grand Lodge afterwards made a generous collection so that Pritchard should not lose out from his defence of Freemasonry. It seems from these clashes that prompted Grand Lodge, the controversies were such that this was what prompted Grand Lodge to appoint a secretary and to start keeping meetings of its minutes in June 1723. At this meeting, the very first vote called into question the validity of the approbation of the 1723 constitutions. The minute refers to the order, quote, purporting that they had been approved. When the meeting was asked to confirm the general regulations printed in the book so far as they were consistent with the ancient rules of Masonry, it was decided that the question should be not put, and instead a pointed resolution was passed, quote, that it is not in the power of any person or body of men to make any alteration or innovation in the body of Masonry without the consent first obtained of the annual Grand Lodge. The implication of this being that the Constitution had perhaps effected such changes without proper consent. Tempers remained frayed, and much of the opprobrium was directed at Desaguliers. In November, William Huddleston, the master of the Lodge of the King's Head in Ivy Lane, was expelled from the Grand Lodge and removed from his mastership for casting aspersions against Desaguliers. Now, I'll go back to this high-risk thing with the PowerPoint again a second. Well, we'll see if we get this one. No, I'll stop there instead. Anderson's role in the writing of the new Book of Constitutions was evidently part, but not the whole reason, for the controversies surrounding its publication. How was Anderson recruited? Anderson claimed that it was a personal commission to him from the Duke of Montagu. He also claimed that he was, at that time, made a warden of the Grand Lodge. However, Anderson personally forged Grand Lodge minutes to substantiate his claim to be a warden, and he was probably never made warden. In fact, it seems probable that Anderson was not even a Mason at the time he was commissioned to revise the constitutions. The clue as to how Anderson came to be asked to work on the commissions is in the advertisements for the Book of Constitutions, which appeared in February 1723. At the same time as the Book of Constitutions was advertised, one of its publishers, John Hook, was advertising Interviews in the Realms of Death, a translation of David Fassmann's Dialogues of the Dead, a popular German series of dialogues between historical characters. Hook was joined in the publication of this literature by Richard Ford and John Graves, and they used the same printers as the Book of Constitutions, William Hunter. The engravings in the interviews, you can see here on the left, also seem very similar to the work of John Pine, who engraved the frontispiece of the Book of Constitutions. Anderson's involvement in this project for the translation of the Dialogues of the Dead illustrates his knowledge and receptiveness to contemporary European Enlightenment thought. Richard Ford had previously published sermons and other works by Anderson, and it was evidently Ford who introduced Anderson to this book, to the Book of Constitutions project. Following the ways in which Anderson alters and develops Fassman's original text, including, for example, inserting a reference to the Grand Lodge of Freemasons being like the chivalric order of the Hospitallers, provides fascinating insights into his working methods as a historian and editor. Anderson and his publishers had great hopes for the interviews of the Realms of Death. The aim was to publish in monthly instalments translations of 38 of Fassman's conversations. Anderson stated that the conversations will form, quote, not only the compendious history of former times, but even a continuation of the news and present state of Europe beginning anno 1718. However, we can see in the translation Anderson slowly tying himself up in knots with some of the political and religious implications of Fassman's text. After translating 3 conversations, the project for the translation of these interviews was first delayed and then dropped because, in Anderson's words, it's being very laborious. Right, let's see what happens with this one. There we go. The key team behind the production of the 1723 constitutions was taken from the interviews in the Realms of Death. Hooke as publisher, Anderson as author, Hunter as printer, and perhaps Pine as engraver. Hooke was joined as publisher by John Senex, who's best known for his beautiful maps and globes, but was also a prolific scientific publisher. Senex was involved in publishing many of the key scientific authors of the period, including Hawkesby, Gravesand, Whiston, and Newton. Senex had a close working relationship. For Desaguliers, tickets for Desaguliers' public lectures were sold at Senex's shop, and Senex published Desaguliers' Course of Experimental Philosophy. Senex's name appears first on the title page of the Book of Constitutions, implying he was the major partner in the production of the Constitutions. His contribution, however, was probably largely financial, supporting the production of a book with a much longer print run and higher quality production than Hooke would have been able to manage on his own. Senex also provided the link with Desaguliers, who prominently contributed the dedication. All of which emphasises that the Book of Constitutions was primarily a project driven by Senex and Hooke and other publishers rather than by Grand Lodge and Anderson. And this is made clear by the title page, where the imprint makes it clear that the publisher and owners of the copyright were Senex and Hooke. After the death of Hooke in 1730, his business and all the copyrights owned by it were acquired by Richard Chandler, who was to be one of the publishers of the 1738 constitutions. Anderson was, as James Roberts hints, paid by the page as a mercenary scribbler for his work on both books of constitutions. Grand Lodge had no claim over the contents of this Book of Constitutions beyond providing its approbation. But of course, this was a valuable imprimatur. The Book of Constitutions went through a long print run. Probably as many as 5,000 copies were produced. But with the growth of Freemasonry, by the early 1730s, copies were beginning to become scarce. And this can be seen from this manuscript copy of the 1723 constitutions in the Museum of Freemasonry in London, which in the catalogue it wrongly suggests that maybe it's in Desaguliers' hand. It's not. It's a copy that was made for lodge use and suggests that by the early 1730s it was easier to copy out a copy of the Book of Constitutions than acquire a printed copy. Which brings us to Anderson's celebrated complaint to Grand Lodge about the publication of William Smith's pocketbook in 1735. Anderson was, of course, telling Grand Lodge fibs when he claimed he owned the copyright of the Book of Constitution and that Smith's book infringed his rights. Anderson had no such claim, but he was a man in desperate straits, as in October 1734, as this register entry records, he was sent to the Fleet prison as a bankrupt, and he was trying desperately to clear his debts. The eventual production of the 1738 Book of Constitutions was closely linked to the collapse of Anderson's finance. It's possible that Anderson not only exaggerated his own claim to the copyright of the Book of Constitutions, but that he may also have exaggerated the competition from the pocket companions. It's likely the pocket companions were principally aimed at the Irish market. The first companion had a title page stating it was published for Ebenezer Ryder at Blackmore Street near Clare Market in London in 1735, but this is difficult to credit because by June 1735, Ryder had managed to get finance to begin printing a journal in Dublin and was producing an Irish edition of the Pocket Companion. It's therefore likely that this first Pocket Companion was in fact produced by Ryder in Ireland and sold by a collaborator under a false title in London. If so, Ryder's partner was probably John Torbuck, who published a number of books in partnership with Ryder. Torbuck's close collaboration with Irish booksellers is evident from his imprisonment in 1739, and that's another one that's gone wrong, sorry, in 1739 for publishing debates in the House of Lords. Torbuck had brought the transcript of the debates from a Dublin bookseller, which shows his close links with obtaining material from Dublin. And when he was released from Newgate, Torbuck went to Dublin, where his partnership with Ryder flourished, and the comparatively short early history of the Pocket Companions came to an end. So I think there's so many stories to be told about the development of the 1723 constitutions, and I hope that this 300th anniversary will give a prompt, as it has done this afternoon, to a much wider discussion and investigation of the story of 1723. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Prescott. The next presenter is Professor Susan Mitchell Sommers from St. Vincent College. Professor Sommers is a historian, and among the work that she is working on right now is particularly on the religious thought of James Anderson, but also she has worked on the origins of Freemasonry, as well as other histories of the 18th century. Professor Sommers, thank you.
I will try. Now, you might have to help me get my PowerPoint. And there I am. Yeah.
Perfect, so this, and it's looking good. So, just, we need to click this.
Computers are bad enough, but when they're doing a different language than I'm used to. Yeah.
That's it?
That's it.
Yeah, perfect.
Words should be coming up. Ah, there they are. All right. So, hello, and thank you very much. And I apologize for speaking in English, but even those of you who don't understand English will get more out of it than you would my attempts at speaking French. In 1720, an audible snicker like that one rippled across London as a controversial Presbyterian clergyman was mocked in two scurrilous pamphlets, Priapia Presbyteriana, the Presbyterian Peasel, rapidly followed by Anti-Priapia Presbyteriana, or an answer to the Priapia Presbyteriana. In each, James Anderson, 1679 to 1739, minister to the Scots Presbyterian Church in St. James, is named. And in one, he is chastised as if in mid-sermon while in his pulpit. Quit for shame thy canting stuff. Quit thy feigned ecstasies and raptures, and thy burlesquing of the scriptures. Quit thy tub rhapsodies and nonsense, and thy protesting on thy conscience. quit thy down looks and squeezed out tears, and thy long, long blasphemous prayers. Quit thy pretensions unto grace, thy hems, thy haws, and set-form face, thy sniveling nose and lubber lips, and thy communion-sitting hips. Even if one does not follow the period slang in its entirety, the message is plain. Anderson is a spiritual fraud, guilty of the worst sort of melodramatic posturing. Further, the pamphlet titles are evidence that he was accused of some sexual, or at least genital, offense. But was he really an egregious cant with a bad case of syphilis, as the pamphlets claim? This is an attack on a man who, perhaps more than anyone else at the time, was a visible representative of the Scottish Kirk in London. The pamphlets mock Anderson, whom one calls the Kirk's missionary at London, for rampant sexual improprieties, but their focus is also on his alien nationality and foreign church. He is a Scottish Presbyterian, a nonconformist, camped out in the shadow of the Church of St. James, Westminster. A person to be feared and distrusted, he is out to seduce a neighbor's wife, and his Book of Constitutions is coming to your Masonic Lodge in the very near future. The Priapia pamphlets belong to what was then already an old and not terribly clever literary trope, and one which incidentally figures in Anderson's personal experience. In 1697, while still a student in Aberdeen, which you see up here, he was summoned to testify against William Abercrombie, minister at Lauder in Scotland, who had asserted in Anderson's presence that the way to be a Presbyterian minister was to speak nonsense with confidence. I was raised Presbyterian. I can tell you this is true. Now the tables were turned, and it was Anderson who was accused of spouting nonsense. What exactly was he saying in his sermons and publications to attract such venom? More to our point, what were James Anderson's religious beliefs, and how are they reflected in his published works, including the Masonic Book of Constitutions? I will examine this question through the lens of Anderson's three most significant books of the 1730s: Royal Genealogies from 1732, Unity in Trinity and Trinity in Unity from 1733, and the second edition of the Masonic Book of Constitutions from 1738. All are the result of work begun in previous decades and are firmly grounded in Anderson's education, various intellectual engagements, and strongly Calvinist theology. I argue that in many ways he was a typical, or at least consistent, Scottish Presbyterian clergyman of his time, and at the same time a significant, though unsung, figure in the early Scottish Enlightenment. Anderson was educated in Aberdeen between 1690 and 1702. We don't have any images, authentic images that we can verify were of Anderson, but this was his brother, who was a professor of theology at King's College in Aberdeen. Anderson himself attended both King's and Marischal College in Aberdeen. There, as in all the ancient Scotch universities, the curriculum was updated by educational reforms introduced to Scotland by a dense web of personal and institutional connections to the largely continental Republic of Letters, as detailed by Esther Meyer in her useful study of the ties that bound Scottish scholars to the Netherlands between 1650 and 1750. At every juncture in his education and career as a minister, Anderson was examined for theological orthodoxy, and he swore fidelity to the Westminster Confession of Faith. That's wrong. Is that wrong? I may have to go back to that. This foundational Calvinist document, written in 1646 in England and reaffirmed in Scotland in 1690, was the Kirk's standard for faith and practice, subordinate only to the Bible, which was, of course, considered infallible. Anderson's assimilation of its tenets profoundly informed all of his published works. The first of the three books we'll consider is Royal Genealogies. It will get there we go. Or the genealogical tables of emperors, kings, and princes from Adam to these times in 2 parts. It's a massive work and undoubtedly took longer than the 7 years Anderson admits to, which is likely an allusion to his Old Testament namesake, Jacob. Royal Genealogies embodies Anderson's claim to be a trailblazer of the Scottish Enlightenment, which is often located after the 1760s, but which Anderson demonstrates begins to appear much earlier in the century. Anderson's work is characteristic of much of the writing of the Scottish Enlightenment that comes afterwards. It is a comprehensive history of his topic, resorting to conjecture where evidence is lacking, and reliant on the work of 16th and 17th century chronologers to synchronize the ages of dynasties of man together into a coherent whole. The discipline of chronology focused on reconciling biblical and secular sources to establish a true timeline of human history. But it was fraught with religious implications as non-Christian narratives began to establish events demonstrably prior to biblical creation. Anderson owned several works by Joseph Scaliger, whose 1583 opus Novum did just that and caused reverberations that lasted through the 18th century. Anderson's connection in print to Scaliger and other scholars is reflected both in the preface of Royal Genealogies, in which he thanks the aristocratic owners of several important libraries, and in the contents of his own posthumous catalog of books. Anderson's genealogy began as a translation of a German genealogy of kings by Johann Hubner. Given Anderson's obsessive approach to scholarship, the work soon turned into something larger and more original than its inspiration. Anderson's style was, in his words, copious and plain, assimilating all the sources he could acquire or gain access to. He makes it clear in the preface and elsewhere that he sees this project as an ongoing concern, a body of scholarship he can use in the future to compose family histories for any British aristocrats willing to pay handsomely. Anderson focuses on chronology and her twin, genealogy, because the ages of man are measured in the reigns and dynasties of kings. Combined, these two disciplines form the structure of history. And Anderson argues that his finished work is an abridgment of universal history and may be used as an index or dictionary to all history. He offers the work as a concordance for students and scholars and a corrective to other works, quote, whose authors have been either ignorant or negligent of chronology and genealogy, without which any history is flawed, imperfect, and perplexing. Anderson hoped this publication would validate his stature as an individual and that it would sell well. It needed to sell because he owned the copyright. Unlike everything else, he owned the copyright for this and was responsible for all the costs associated with publishing it. Anderson reassures those who read the preface that he has avoided all terms and expressions that may give offense to any nation or family, to any party or person, having nothing to do with the national controversies of historians, nor with the ecclesiastical and religious debates of theologians, nor with the politics of statesmen. Instead, Anderson promises to allow every nation to enjoy its own fable, in his words, within the safe confines of the widely approved chronology devised by Bishop James Ussher, which begins sensibly with creation at approximately 6 p.m. on the 22nd of October, 4004 BCE. Even though Anderson lined up an impressive list of booksellers, sales were disappointing. In the end, Anderson was acknowledged by a eulogist as a gentleman who, by more than 20 years' study, gave the world a book of inconceivable labor and universal use. Nevertheless, the expense of researching and paying for publication also sent him to Fleet Prison, as we've seen, which was a sad recompense. The year after Royal Genealogies was published, Anderson produced his main religious work, Unity in Trinity and Trinity in Unity, a copy of which he presented to Marischal College in gratitude for an honorary doctorate of divinity, which he was awarded in 1731. For those unfamiliar with the Westminster Confession, a brief description of some of its primary points will be helpful for what follows. In common with many Protestant confessions, the Westminster version lists as essential belief in the Trinity, sola scriptura, and sola fide. And, as was also common, the Westminster Confession states that the Pope is the Antichrist, that Catholic Mass is idolatry, and Protestants are forbidden to marry Catholics. More controversially, the confession requires belief in predestination, both to salvation and damnation. In either case, life after death is eternal. Finally, even believers destined for salvation or election are totally depraved by reason of original sin. They achieve salvation through God's grace and Christ's sacrifice. The sinner himself has nothing to do with the outcome. If that sounds a bit harsh, many of Anderson's contemporaries, even in nonconformist circles, heartily agreed. In 1719, in 1719, and I've lost my point, Anderson was involved in the Salters Hall debates, which were symptomatic of ever-widening disagreements between English nonconformists on basic tenets of Christian orthodoxy. The primary focus of the debates was whether belief in the Trinity was justified by Scripture, and if so, was it then permissible to require nonconformist ministers to subscribe to it? Tempers ran high. A probably apocryphal account divided the ministers into those who were against persecution on account of belief in the Trinity, their own, who went up to the gallery, and those who favored the proposed requirement who stayed below, each shouting at the other. And you can see the little shouts up there in that image, the little ribbons of invective. Anderson stayed below, but when the voting went to a second round, he was on the losing side. He pursued that point for the rest of his life, defending it in Unity and Trinity, and in the changes to the first Masonic charge in the 1738 edition of the Book of Constitutions. Anderson took his time mulling over the problem of non-Trinitarians. Then in 1733, he published Unity and Trinity, yes? Oh, no, I thought he was interrupting me already. Unity and Trinity in Unity. There we go. This work is tedious and thorough and serves to dispel any notion that Anderson was sympathetic to any position other than strictly Orthodox Trinitarianism. The structure of the work is modeled on the way biblical proofs are included in the Westminster Confession, but he does not limit himself to Scripture to support his argument. This is a demonstration of his theological and historical scholarship, with flourishes towards erudition. Anderson cites all manner of sources: Greek, Roman, biblical, Talmudic, the Apocrypha, early Christian fathers. He even praises Muslims for respectful treatment of Jesus in their teachings. Anderson denounces all the wicked Christian polytheists, from Catholics and Arians to Socinians, Unitarians, misers, voluptuaries, ambitious men, and those who fear Satan so much that they raise him up to rival God. He then goes on to deflate the confidence of mathematicians, natural philosophers, and all who believe that reason is a sufficient guide to religious truth. It is not. Anderson affirms the principle of election twice in this treatise, election meaning predestination, but declines to argue that only Reformed Christians will be saved, asserting secret things belong to God. In this work, Anderson was not an innovative theologian, but he did not need to be. Everything necessary had already been revealed and proved. He was just there to reiterate that orthodoxy was unassailable. Anderson addresses another preoccupation of the Scottish Enlightenment in this work, the problem of origins. While this fascination could be imposed on any historical topic, his brother Adam wrote a comprehensive history of British commerce and empire from the very beginning. James fixes on the origin of true religion. In the process, he explores and defines a term many will recognize from his Masonic writings, the religion in which all men agree. Unsurprisingly, Anderson demonstrates that this is the religion of the patriarchs, and that distorted traces of it can be found in the world's religions even now. In his estimation, only Orthodox Christians have returned to the core beliefs of the true religion, which remain unchanged from the days of Noah, who in Anderson's hands bears an uncanny theological similarity to contemporary Scottish Presbyterians. Anderson arranges these beliefs in three interrelated groups, foreshadowing the three great articles of Noah of the 1738 constitutions. These are belief in the Trinity, absolutely essential. And since the Trinity cannot be discerned by reason, the necessity of revelation contained in Scripture as the infallible rule of life and faith. Finally, immortality of the soul, though whether this is eternal bliss or torment depends on election. Anderson argues that this is what the patriarchs believed, with the exception of Scripture, since they had revelation directly from God, which he terms traditional revelation. Anderson is not a particularly original thinker in his search for the original religion of mankind. He shares a fascination with the origins of true religion with many other early modern scholars, and they are amply represented in the catalog of his library. This obsession with origins is what led to the early modern focus on the ancient art of chronology in the first place. Anderson's education and the contents of his library argue that he had the historical, genealogical, philological, hard to say after a glass of wine, mathematical, and even astronomical skills and reference works to verify a given reconciliation between biblical and secular dating, which is what chronology was all about. But he spared himself the heavy lifting required to propose an original system of reconciliation, unlike Isaac Newton, who did that. The place Anderson was compelled to innovate was the Book of Constitutions. Yes, Andrew and I are the ones who say it started in 1721. But this is neither the time nor the place to talk about that. Anderson has to innovate in the Book of Constitutions because he is the originator of that genre of printed Masonic handbooks. While that freed his hands somewhat, he was also bound to produce what the new Grand Lodge requested, which Desaguliers reports in the dedication to the 1723 edition, was to compile and digest this book from the old records, and he lauded how accurately he has compared and made everything agreeable to history and chronology so as to render these new constitutions a just and exact account of Masonry from the beginning of the world to your Grace's mastership, still preserving all that was truly ancient and authentic in the old ones. Nothing about Anderson's relationship with Freemasonry or composition of the Book of Constitution is straightforward. And here is, again, neither the time nor the place to try to straighten the story out. Suffice it to say that when Anderson was forced to innovate, the results were mixed. Weaving together an authentic history of Freemasonry from Adam to the present would have been beyond anyone's abilities, especially given what Anderson had to work with: general records, traditions, old charges, especially the Cook manuscript. He brought his knowledge of history and chronology, and fashioning a document that twinned the evolution of architecture with the lineage of Grand Masters of Freemasonry, he hoped for the best. What Anderson produced in 1723 was conjectural history at its best. Early in the account, hardly a sentence is not qualified by supposition. Maybe, undoubtedly, probably. The 1738 edition of the Book of Constitution is a different matter. In this, let me find my place again, the historical section of the Book of Constitution increases from around 10,000 words to 200,000 words. Anderson accomplished that by a wholesale importation of genealogical material from the royal genealogies, a much fuller use of documentary evidence, and a greater attention to style and structure. He also embellished freely and apparently at whim, sometimes following an agenda of his own, and sometimes for reasons that we can't discern from this distance. Ironically, then, it's the historical section of the 1738 Constitutions that stands as Anderson's most famous and important, influential historical writing. It is also the fullest example of his credentials as a participant in the early Scottish Enlightenment, as he brings together that movement's characteristic obsessions with stadial history, history in clear stages or eras, chronology, origins, philology, antiquarianism, and a willingness to substitute conjecture for factual evidence when it seems essential to the flow of the argument. And through the constitutions, Anderson transmitted those same methods and obsessions to millions of Freemasons the world over, encoding the DNA of the Scottish Enlightenment into English Freemasonry and its offspring for the rest of Masonic time. But I digress. Anderson's handling of religion in the constitutions is equally interesting, but probably did not have the impact he intended. I believe that the majority of the interpretations of Anderson's version of the first Masonic charge, as you see here, concerning God and religion, are entirely opposite to what he meant. Anderson was briefer and more circumspect when he composed the 1723 constitutions. He was working under deadline, and if his claim is to be believed, under at least some supervision. The first charge obliges the brethren to be moral and neither an atheist nor anti-Trinitarian. At that time, and in a religious context, libertine meant a religious freethinker, someone who was not an Orthodox believer. Remember Anderson's obsession with the Trinity and orthopraxis. He goes on in his charge to assert that within that compass, denomination and persuasion are immaterial. You could be, and this is not a complete list, but it's very nearly a complete list, you could be an Anglican, a Huguenot, a Presbyterian, an Independent, or Dutch Reform. Your choice. Any of those are good. By 1738, seeing all too well that the libertines were gaining the upper hand, Anderson was more explicit. In the first charge, he repeats the earlier injunctions against atheists and libertines. But now he introduces the 3 great articles of Noah, which has consternated readers ever since. The 3 great articles of Noah don't appear anywhere. What the devil did he mean? Theological literature and more recent analysis of Anderson's text are replete with the 7 laws of Noah. But Anderson is very clear, repeating virtually the same phraseology in the historical section on Zoroaster, saying, "We leave every brother to liberty of conscience, but strictly charge him carefully to maintain the cement of the lodge and the 3 articles of Noah." What are the 3 articles? Anderson tells you in Unity and Trinity that the cement of Protestant Christian belief, as well as that of the patriarchs, is the original religion. Belief in the Trinity, revelation as contained in Holy Scripture, and an immortal soul. No one else needs to apply. Thank you. That's why I was waving it at you.
Thank you very much for another thought-provoking paper. And the last presentation of today by Mr. John Belton, a member of the Research Lodge Quaternoti and author of the English Masonic Union of 1813, will talk about another related topic, William Smith and his pocket companions of 1735.
I'm trying to help.
No, perfect.
There you go.
Okay.
Let me see if this works.
Yeah, should do.
Yeah. Just click here.
Yeah.
Thank
No. Okay, right. Right, the light's a bit difficult, but we've heard a little bit from Andrew Prescott about William Smith and his pocket companion. Well, you're going to hear a little bit more about William Smith and his pocket companions. Oh.
It's working here.
Oh,
Yeah, I'll do that.
right. If you go back to the 1730s, by that time, Anderson's constitutions of 1723 had been sold out. So there was a real problem if you wanted to learn anything about Freemasonry and for it to be up to date. And William Smith and his pocket companion, he produced it with a specific objective in mind. And this specific objective was that it was not to be found in any one of our books yet published as a small volume, easily portable, which might render what before difficult to come at and troublesome to carry about of more extensive use. For it had been long remarked that the great numbers, especially of younger Masons, who have yet been desirous of knowing something of the craft, have had a long time frustrated in their pursuit for want of something of this kind. So here is the first publication which purported to provide some sort of Masonic education. It was, and we'll see as we go on that it did particularly to do that. So that was a sentiment that hadn't been heard before in English Masonry. So it was, in that sense, it was quite radical.
John, is this yours?
No? Because I suppose the next question is who was William Smith? William Smith, if you look at it, he was from a family of Ulster booksellers in Dublin. And if you go on in the Book of Ireland and the French Enlightenment, 1700 to 1807, the description is, John Smith was in partnership with his cousin William Bruce from 1725 to 1738, that they carried a thriving business made in French and English books. John's uncle William Smith travelling to Holland to buy stock for the bookshop in Dublin, which was on Blind Quay. So this partly answers some of Andrew's questions before about the connections. So William Smith definitely had a connection with booksellers in Dublin. But also probably in London, because it's indicated that, of course, that William was a book dealer and that he regularly crossed the North Sea. So in the process of then getting back to Dublin with his books, he would probably at some point have had to have crossed England, and that will also feature a little bit later. The name William Smith comes up on several occasions, notably in 1736 in Book M, published in Newcastle upon Tyne. But coming back to the provenance of this, the first part of the Pocket Companion was published in the end of 1734. And we know that because at the back of it was a book of songs. The first part obviously hadn't been finished. The book of songs is followed by a list of lodges, and in the list of lodges, the last one listed was in November 1734. So presumably the book would have been published after that date. It's quite interesting that taking it from there, by the time we come to early 1735, the complete Pocket Companion had been published, because in the proceedings in Grand Lodge of the 24th of February 1735, Anderson is on his feet fulminating. He's angry. Anderson further represented that one William Smith, said to be a Mason, had without his privity or consent pirated a considerable part of the constitutions of Masonry aforesaid, to the prejudice of the said brother Anderson, it being his...
It works now.
Okay.
No, but now this doesn't work.
Okay. Right, which is the moving it on button?
No, but it's not working.
Oh, okay. Okay, I'll keep going. Right. So anyway, it was therefore resolved and ordered that every member and warden present shall do all in their power to discourage the purchase of this document. And that is what happened.
Okay. No, but it's...
Okay.
Let's see if it...
I suspect that what William Smith really wanted is he wanted the commission to write a replacement book of constitutions. I suspect that he played it badly. Anderson got to hear of it. They hadn't done the homework with Grand Lodge, and the whole edifice came to nothing. And I suspect also that the next part of it was the republication of the Pocket Companion in Dublin through a similar through E. Ryder. But there we go. That's part. So it's interesting to look at what Smith was actually offering within his pocket companion. Let's see. Anyway, and he was offering a variety of things that were going to be of interest. So, first of all, there was a traditional history. This was not based on the Anderson style of what a great reverend I am and how good I am with my biblical concordances. This is based on telling the story. So we're starting to move away from a very formal thing. You'd never want to take Anderson's Constitutions to bed to read in the evening. The pocket companion, you might do it. So he revises the history, and having revised the history, he moves on to Anderson's charges, he does the regulations, and after that, he does various other bits, and I'm going to save one bit of that till the last, because it's a bit of a discovery. He did all sorts of things. He introduced prologues and epilogues. These are curious things. They are, if you like, almost a promotion of Masonic values, but in a very, very Georgian style. So I will read one to you, and I hasten to say, if you don't like what you hear, just pretend you haven't heard it. It was what the Georgians said. That beauteous ladies by their sparks adored never could wheedle out the magic word, and oft their favours have bestowed in vain, nor would one secret for another gain. I thought unable to explain the matter. Each mason first must be a woman hater. With sudden fear and dismal horror shook, I heard my spouse was to subscribe the book. By all our loves, I begged him to forbear. Upon my knees, I begged and tore my hair. When he came back, I found a change 'tis true, but forth a change as did his youth renew. With rosy cheeks and smiling grace he came, and sparkling eyes that speak a bridegroom's flame. I don't know how the translator got on with that, but this was a somewhat raucous Georgian style, and that they wrote a lot in this sort of manner. So the pocket companion had various other things as well, but it was also the first thing. It was written in a more prose, more oratorical style, without the stiltedness of Anderson, and without the catechismic style of the ritual. The pocket companions didn't stop there, because Andrews looked at this one. There was another one that came up in 1752 by Jonathan Scott and John Entick. And they set about doing exactly the same thing. They did a pocket companion in 1752. Of course, by this time Anderson was long dead. There was a need for something else. And they'd obviously prepared the ground. And there's a long bit in the quarterly communications, the memorial of Brother Jonathan Scott, referred to from the last quarterly communication, was read, purporting that a few or none of the Book of Constitutions printed in the year 1738 remained unsold, and that the copy thereof, having fallen into the hands of a bookseller, who for his private advantage threatened to reprint it, also entirely ignorant of the necessary alterations and additions required. So he put this to Grand Lodge, and Grand Lodge accepted that. So he actually got the contract to do that. But it's interesting when you go back to look at the pocket companions as to what was in them. Because when you come to the history, they'd found a little bit more. They spent a considerable amount of time and hunting around. We get added a letter from King Solomon to King Hiram regarding the construction of the temple at Jerusalem and the need for stone and for wood to come down from Lebanon and presumably be offloaded at Joppa and taken up to build the temple. And he says to Hiram, what would you like in exchange? And King Hiram replies that he would really like corn and olive oil, which were the products from that part of up in the hills, and that would be most useful. And they come to an agreement. This section is all put in apostrophes, so you know it's a quote. I was going to show you a picture, but I did the simple thing. I asked Google, where did the quote come from? And it told me it was from Josephus Flavius, the history of the Jews, the antiquity of the Jews, or that. It was a very similar title to that. And people forget, because they very often think that the Masonic ritual came from the Bible, and they pick up a Bible and they look at the verses and the chapters and the verses, and they say, yes. Well, actually, what did tend to happen an awful lot is people used other sources. So there was a history of the Jews written by Philostorgus in 300 AD. If you want to learn about the discovery of the vault, which leads up to the Royal Arch, the legend seems to me quite clearly to start with Philostorgus. And when you want the bit about the Temple of Jerusalem, quite clearly, either Scott or Entick had access to a copy of Josephus Flavius, Book 12. So I think we need to look again at where the origins of our Masonic rituals come from. William Smith's pocket companions had a long life, a varied life. They continued to be published in Ireland, and they ran to 17 editions. The Jonathan Scott version of 1752 was taken up by Scotland, and that ran to, they reprinted the Smith edition twice, and the Scott one ran to a total of 30 editions, partly printed in Edinburgh or partly printed in Glasgow. The Scotland one is particularly interesting because the Grand Lodge of Scotland did not publish its own Book of Constitutions till 1839. It's a long, long haul from 1754 to 1839. And this was filled by pocket companions, in which various sets of regulations are listed, and strange things. People deal with the sufferings imposed in Baal and the persecution of Freemasons in Germany and in Holland, and they also look at the trouble they had with the church in Scotland. So you can see the pocket companions really were something that was of real, genuine use to the ordinary brother. In doing all this work, I was forced to go through numerous documents. And at one time, looking at the Royal Arch, I happened to pick up Achiman Raison. That's the constitutions of the ancients, and look at the version of 1756. And I guess if I say to you that Lawrence Dermot said that the Royal Arch was the root, heart and marrow of Freemasonry, a lot of you will have heard of that quote. It's a really good quote, and I'm sure he means it, but what the people who took that quote didn't do is they didn't read down to the end of the paragraph. They did not read the paragraph. So what they missed is a statement by Dermot that those who think that they are a Royal Archmason, who haven't been through the chair, are really not. And to support this claim, I quote my friend Fifield Daseny and his Impartial Inquisition of 1744, printed in Dublin. So even in 1756, clearly Dermot and the ancients knew they got a problem with the Royal Arch, that the brethren wanted it by almost any means and went out to get it. But they fought it and they fought it. So I went through every edition of Achiman Raison until I got to 1800. And 1800, of course, we're coming up to the beginning of the start of thinking about a union, and the ancients actually had a grand chapter and had a set of rules. And in this set of rules, okay, it's just one of these days, one thing and another. And Article 3, it set out the requirements to become a Royal Archmason. And what it didn't say is it didn't say anymore, you have to be a master past the chair. And it gave the form of a certificate that would be subscribed to by the master and wardens of the lodge where the candidate was coming from, to say that he had regularly been through all the degrees, had been made a master mason, had proved himself of good worth, and to be a good geometrical master mason, and they would thoroughly recommend him to join the chapter. So suddenly, this thing about the passing the degree chair vanishes, because we can see how it happened, when it started, and we can see actually when Grand Lodge gave in. And it's the Grand Lodge giving in bit that we don't know about. But there's another thing came out of this, and this is going to be my question for Professor Sommers. When I looked at the Achiman Raison, of course it has Anderson's charges in it. 1756, and when it comes to the first charge of God and religion, it's not the 1723 one that they choose, but it's the 1738 one. So when Spratt did his Irish constitutions in 1750, he used the 1738 version. And the commentators just say, oh, well, Spratt just didn't know any better, he just copied. And I think that might not be right. Because having then gone back and looked at the Achiman Raison, I see that Anderson and his first charge is the 1738 version, the Noah Kidai, the Christian version. And that was the one it lasted for 1738. When Scott and Entick reprinted their pocket companion and the constitutions, they went back to the 1723 version. So the very accepting of all, relatively all creed version. And that 1723 version was accepted by the Grand Lodge in London. It was accepted by the Scottish Masons and appeared in all those pocket companions. But when you come to Achim Dermot, the ancients, and Achiman Raison, they only accepted the 1738 version. And interestingly, when you go and look at Ireland, Ireland also only accepted the 1738 version, the No Kidai Christian version. And I can't answer the question why that would be. I just can't think particularly. Was it a religious thing? Was it a social thing? Was it a hangover from the Reformation? Was it just what the members preferred? So I don't know. But there's a sort of dividing line between maybe English establishment and maybe Scottish establishment, and the ancients who were perhaps slightly lower class, perhaps slightly more religiously not nonconformist, maybe, I don't know. I don't have the answer to that question, but it's an intriguing question. So that's why I've had a chat with Professor Sommers to say, can she shed any light on that? And she will tell you afterwards. There is one last discovery. When I picked up the Pocket Companion of 1735, I read it. I read enough of every part of it. I have to admit, I'd opened it and looked at it probably 10 times before, and there was something in it called a charge to a newly admitted brother. I'd never read this before, but it says, "My brother, this evening, you have been admitted a member of our ancient and honourable institution. Ancient, no doubt it is, having subsisted from time immemorial." And it goes on, and it says, "On the three great duties you owe, and the first one is to God, the second is to your neighbour," and it says, "by acting with him on the square, and third, to yourself." Now, interestingly, this is written in a beautiful oratorical style, and I gave you the first couple of lines of it straight out of the top of my head. It reminded me of my initiation day in 1980. The essence of the values and the way it was put over hadn't changed. I have, by chance, discovered, I think, the first bit of oratorical prose ritual extant. Before, in 1730, of course, we had Pritchard's Masonry dissected, which was all catechism. Here we have a beautiful bit of oratory, and it's still in use to this day. I've showed it to my brothers, and he said, "It's just the same. It's just the same as when I was initiated." Well, he's not quite right, but there we are. I use this to point out that the Pocket Companions between 1735 and the 1760s, 70s in England, and about 1810, 1820 in Scotland, are the only source of Masonic education and other things that are genuinely thought to be of interest to the brethren and published specifically for them. I commend this extra source. I have to say thank you to Books Google. They scanned pretty much all of them, and you too can have all of them and read them at your leisure. It's a valuable source of research. I commend them to you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor. We have time for questions, couple of minutes. Paul, you wanted to ask?
We've sort of got the slides working if there was anything that John wanted to actually show that he was unable to show.
Guillermo, I'll speak.
Yeah, go ahead.
No?
A few practical announcements. The reception tonight is in the restaurant on top of the building on the 7th floor. It's a nice reception and a nice view of the city. The museum will be open, so you can go in it when you want. But I don't want you to think that the reception is in the museum, because it would look like we're just going to give you water. And I wouldn't want you to go away with a glass of water. I ask you to inform people so they don't think they can wait in the museum to see food. The food's up in the restaurant, and the museum is open for your entertainment. It has a superb exhibit on the Egyptian influence. The other thing is, some of you are family or friends of the late but rather remarkable John Accuster, and as part of room three, some people will be gathering to hear a paper on him as part of the proceedings after this adjournment. And so a way to say something nice about someone who was rather extraordinary and made a contribution to Masonry and to scholarship. So that will be one of the papers to be presented after this cause. Please join us in the restaurant tonight. We have the reception listed at 7, but there will be food there at 6. So we hope you will not go away hungry, and we have a few gifts to give out. I'll turn it now back to Guillermo.
Is there any questions, Roger?
I would like to ask a question to Andrew but in some way to Susan too. Andrew told us the story of the first constitutions, and of course it's a very interesting story because it's the beginning of the story of the book of constitutions. And Susan spoke about the 1723 version of the first charge and the 1738 version. But there is something between the two, not in England, but in France. Because we know a manuscript, a French manuscript of 1735, which was never printed. It was for the private use of French lodges, written by, or at least under the authority of Hector Maclean, who was at the time Grand Master in France. And in that very, very first French version of the constitutions, there is a slight but very interesting modification of the first charge, where Anderson writes that religion in which all men agree, the French text is that religion in which all Christians agree. And of course, this modification has raised an important, long, and sometimes very passionate debate among Masonic French historians. Some of them think that it was a deliberate alteration of Anderson texts so as to contradict the supposed liberal or too liberal spirit of the first charge, despite the fact that I don't believe at all that Anderson was liberal in matter of religion. And some others think that it was a correct translation for Maclean, because for him and for his friends, that religion in which all men agree was simply all the denomination and persuasions which are referred to later in the text. So, and I remember a paper written by Eric Ward and published in AQC in the 1960s, and which was entitled Anderson's Freemasonry Not Deistic. So my question is, in your opinion, was Maclean's translation right or not?
Whether it's right
Can I-
is another matter, but it's that reference is...
Yes,
Whether it's right is a difficult matter, but that reference is... I remember, it's one of those things, you know how you remember you looked at something before the pandemic, and now you remember you should have looked at it more recently, and I'd looked precisely at Maclean's manuscript, and you're right. But I think in investigating this, the other point you're making is that we shouldn't just do it in a British context, we should do it in a European context. Because John was saying about the 1738 constitutions and how that's borrowed. The first German printing of the constitutions takes the wholesale 1738 constitutions, including the Noachidae. So that goes to Germany. But on the other hand, with the Irish one version, some of the early French printings don't take it, and the Irish version alters the story of 1717. So he evidently wasn't just copying blindly. So there's a lot to say there, yeah.
and there is one thing as well that's worth saying. There's an alteration to the first Anderson charge done in Belfast, published by James McGee, for the Orange Lodge number 257, which of course is going to be Protestant.
I think this guy. Can we borrow this?
Oh, sorry.
Technology is
Okay,
not.
right, okay. Right. I found a similar alteration that's been made in, I forget whether it was a Pocket Companion or an Achiman Raison, published in Belfast in the late 18th century. And that was done for the Orange Lodge, number 257, who were obviously Protestants, so they took a Protestant approach to it. So I think there are lots of variants to that first charge.
Susan, do you?
I have forgotten what all the questions are. Yeah, Andrew will speak for me on this point.
You've got my question to answer as well,
Yeah.
so you ought to say something
Yeah,
about it.
I'm supposed to answer his question. I don't know. So there are two ways of looking at it. So of course, from the very beginning, Freemasonry and on the one hand, you know, the Grand Lodge Freemasonry and the Book of Constitutions are both inherently political. You know, whether one wants to acknowledge that or not, but they're inherently political. And what one says about religion in the 17th and 18th century is also a political statement as much as it is a statement of belief. And so was it on purpose? Was it accidental? Was it to be Christian? Was it to stick it to... Who knows? I will have to read these documents and take a good look. But I don't think any of it was without meaning. It was
With meaning.
It was with meaning. Yeah.
I thought it was with meaning, but I didn't know what the meaning was.
Well, I don't either.
Right.
Any other questions? We have time for one more before we go to the break. If not, please join me to thank our presenters for these great discoveries. And we will see you back here at 4 p.m. And there are other 2 rooms that have also events. And see you at 6 or 7 for the reception. Those who want to get the tour for the museum at 18 hours and the reception at 19 hours. Thank you. Merci beaucoup.